Yeah, I'm delighted to welcome you all to another GK Insights event, which we hold periodically on the key topics affecting different aspects of politics and society on the key issues. My name is Joe Cormack. I'm an account director at GK, and I'll be chairing this session. Throughout the session, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A function. I'll then be collating those questions and putting them to our panelists for discussion later on in the session. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with GK Strategy, but just briefly to introduce us as well, we are a strategic research and communications consultancy. We work across a wide range of sectors, but retain a particular specialism in the health and care space. And we're privileged to work with such a broad range of clients in this area, from NHS bodies to providers to technology manufacturers, and also to investors that provide investment into the health system. And so really delighted to have such a strong two individuals with us, not one but two former health ministers, to talk us through what the mental health care landscape looks like in 2021 and beyond, in what really is a watershed year. Start by introducing Phil Hope. Phil is an advisor to GK and regularly supports our clients and advises them on how to navigate the health and care system. Phil was a Labour MP for 13 years and was a care minister in the last Labour government. He's also a commissioner right now with the Health Devolution Commission, which is a cross-party, non-affiliated body looking at the implications of increasingly integrated care and devolution in the health system. Also very pleased to be joined by Sir Norman Lamb, a real advocate in the mental health space, and has been for many years. Most significantly during his time as minister within the coalition government, when he was a health minister and held responsibility for mental health, and brought in quite a few sweeping changes in terms of waiting times, expectations, and such. He currently is the chair of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust with a focus on mental health care. And he too is a commissioner for the Health Devolution Commission as well, and remains involved with many other children and young people's organisations focused on mental health care. So very pleased to introduce both. The way this event is going to go is it's designed as an in-conversation event between Phil and Norman, talk about where we are in mental health care and what the future will hold in terms of reforms. Please do send through your questions, which I'll then be putting to both panelists on the second half of the event. And we've got just a touch under an hour, about 55 minutes for the session. So hopefully it should be a really good one, and we will be summarising key points and takeaways following this. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Phil. Phil, what is the state of play in mental health care? It's been a challenging 12 months, to say the least.
Joe, thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. It's really pleased to welcome you here and to be taking part in the event. And good morning, of course, to Sir Norman, and actually Norman's co-chair of the Health Devolution Commission that I'm a commissioner on, and we've been working quite closely on the reforms that are going through as we speak, and we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But to kick off, Norman, I suppose, could you just give us a bit of a tour de force, as it were, a sort of what's the mental health landscape been like? What's the policy, funding? What was it like before the pandemic, and what's been going on during the pandemic? Kind of what's your big picture take on what's going on? And I might add, not just mental health. I know some of the people joining us are from the world of learning disability as well. So just a sort of an initial your take on the landscape.
Yeah. Well, first of all, great to have this conversation. I think over the last decade or so, we've gone through quite a revolution in terms of our attitudes towards mental health. And indeed, learning disability has at times, sometimes for bad reasons, been in the headlines far more than it perhaps has in the past. Yeah. But I think, awareness and understanding and acceptance of mental health is at a different level to what it was a decade ago. We still got a long way to go, but I think that the work of campaigns like Time to Change has had an impact in reducing stigma. And I think that's very much to be welcomed. Of course, the funding landscape has been pretty tough. Following the crash in 2008, constraints started. I don't want to get into a political argument with you, but they sort of started in the last period of the Labour government. But of course, the coalition then came in, protected the NHS, but didn't protect social care. I don't think, incidentally, that was a wise judgment, because in a way, social care is the sort of preventive end of the spectrum, and I don't think it made sense to cut so deeply into social care. But throughout my time as a minister, we were subject to very tough constraints. I'd love to have been a minister when the money was flowing, because, there was, I'm sure both of us have fond memories of the opportunities you have, because you do have an opportunity to, make a difference. And we introduced the first maximum waiting time standards, for example, in mental health. We set out a blueprint for the modernisation of children and young people's mental health future in mind, and did a whole load of things. Now, what I think has changed is that the sense in the past that mental health got neglected in the funding allocations, I don't think exists any longer. There is this investment standard that the government refers to, which is there to ensure that mental health gets at least the same proportionate increase in funding whenever extra money is given to the NHS. And that has broadly worked, it has to be said. And at the Maudsley at the moment, we've recently secured agreement on additional funding for community services, which will, I think, give us an opportunity to significantly enhance community support. And critically, that has to be working in collaboration with others. And I think it's going to vary from one part of the country to another, but we're very intent on ensuring that there is a genuine collaboration. It's probably likely to be predominantly sort of third sector organizations, community organizations, and so on. But, you're seeing the emergence of what are called alliance contracts. We have an alliance contract in Lambeth, where the Maudsley contracts with the local authority and with a number of third sector organizations to come together to provide better community support. And that has to be the sort of future, bluntly. We now have something called the Community Mental Health Framework, which is NHS England's sort of policy guidance document. And the whole thrust of that is about, in a sense, deinstitutionalizing care. And it reflects what's happened in learning disability as well. I launched, when I was minister, the Transforming Care programme, which is to get people out of institutions. It hasn't been as successful as it should have been, but the numbers in institutions are lower than they were. And that means giving people the opportunity for a better, more fulfilling life in the community. And we know that there are still people who, bluntly, are locked up, who don't need to be locked up. And that's in both mental health and in learning disability. And, in some ways, one could say that it's a human rights issue. I think we have a responsibility to ensure that the least restrictive setting is provided so that someone can live as fulfilled a life as possible.
Okay, so one of the things that I know you championed was this idea of parity of esteem between mental health and, as it were, physical health. I'm still struck by, although those words appear occasionally, if you look at the long-term, the NHS long-term plan, if you look at the conversations that go on, I'm still, it always feels to be people think about health as being hospitals as usual. They think about physical health rather than mental health. And yet from the pandemic, people are saying, we could have a mental health pandemic following the virus because of the impact that it's had on loneliness, isolation. Do you think that in a way, if we get parity of steam, people talk about that more as these new policies, which we'll come onto the detail in a second, come through, we might see more focus on improving people's mental health. I'm thinking particularly maybe children and young people, but other groups too, as a result of the impact of the pandemic.
Well, one would hope so. I mean, I think it's an important point you make about the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Waiting lists, it's important to say, I didn't mention this in my earlier comments, but waiting lists are still shocking, and particularly for children and young people. And it's not uncommon for a teenager to wait a year for treatment, and that is completely intolerable. Yeah. And you know, you end up in a sort of mindset that you see marginal improvements as a success in some way. So at the Maudsley, I was horrified when I saw our board papers saying, you know, we're getting the numbers waiting more than 52 weeks down to a very small number now. Well, that's intolerable. You know, people should be waiting far shorter than that. And my own family has experienced a long wait for mental health care. And of course, the truth is that in our moment of crisis, we paid for care because we were able to, because we couldn't wait. But most people aren't able to do that. So, you know, this goes back. I mean, a gentle prod at the Labour government here. So you introduced, and I think very successfully, maximum waiting time standards in the NHS, which I think was a good thing. You know, the 4-hour A&E standard. It's been gamed a bit, but it's had a massive positive impact. The cancer waiting time standards, that would have saved, you know, very many thousands of lives. And the maximum wait from referral to treatment for any operation. All of that is brilliant. But there were no waiting time standards introduced for mental health. And it's a reflection of our time. You know, at that time, mental health simply wasn't seen as a priority, a political priority, although, you know, the Labour government did good things on mental health. But the trouble was, without those very politically resonant waiting time standards, it distorts judgments about where the money goes at every level of the NHS, because every clinical commission group around the country is intent on trying to meet its very politically resonant waiting time standards. And, you know, if you measure something, it gets done. If you don't measure it, it doesn't get done. And so we've got to keep the fight going, Phil, for parity of esteem. We're not there yet. I think it's declined, the problem, but we're not there yet. And an interesting point, I know we're going to come on to the sort of proposed new architecture for the NHS, but the governing body of the new what's called integrated care system, the ICS, they're not proposing a guaranteed place for mental health at the table, which is, again, it's another example of the disparity, you know, the discrimination in a way against mental health. So the problem's still there. You have to keep fighting the argument.
Well, you've talked about the things that are coming up this year. I mean, there are two big ones, aren't there? There's the NHS Reform White Paper, and there's the Reform of the Mental Health Act. Let's stick with the NHS Reform White Paper, because that's where we're talking about, Norman. I mean, there's a lot of change in there. They're replacing competition as the organising principle with collaboration, and that's going to have an impact across the board, mental health, learning disability, and so on. They're talking a lot about place-based working at the level of the county or the metropolitan borough. What's your take on where mental health kind of sits in all of that? My anxiety is that it doesn't get much of a mention. You just said they're not even put down as a, you know, an automatic member of one of the two boards that are in the structure. So is there a job of work to be done, as it were, to try to shape some of this white paper before it becomes legislation, as it were, to better put mental health, you know, a bit more centre stage?
Well, I'm already working on this point that I mentioned, that, you know, I think mental health as a sort of community needs to shout loudly now to say we must have a guaranteed place at the table, because this will be about, you know, funding allocations. And the acute hospitals are very powerful. You mentioned it earlier. You know, in people's minds, they think of the hospital, possibly a GP, but if the hospitals, the acute trust dominates the decision making, then we'll get, I think, a worse distortion of where the money goes. And of course, it's fair to say that the aftermath of the pandemic, there's both going to be a psychological fallout from the pandemic, which is what you referred to, which is likely to increase waiting times. That's the worrying thing. But on the physical health side, the numbers waiting for treatment are going to rocket. And so there's going to be massive pressure on the acute sector. And the temptation will be to grab more of the resource to the disadvantage of mental health and learning disability. That's my worry.
Right. And do you think that the switch from competition to collaboration is something that's going to help or hinder? I'm thinking about perhaps the voluntary sector, for example, which in the mental health world we know is absolutely critical in terms of reaching communities and providing community-based services and so on in partnership. Does collaboration offer an opportunity or a threat to those providers?
Well, I think it's fascinating in policy terms, and I think it's both a threat and an opportunity. Okay. Actually, right. I mean, we should be in no doubt about the significance of this. Right. And inevitably there's a Brexit element to this, because behind Labour's approach to the NHS, and then the coalition, and then the Conservatives, was the fact that European procurement rules applied. You had to. If you put something out to others, there had to be a proper competitive process. Well, the European competition rules are going, and this shift from competition to collaboration is a very significant sort of move back to the pre New Labour, and it goes, pre Ken Clarke as health minister. So it's almost like an old Labour approach to the NHS, which is extraordinary coming from a Conservative government. And so I think providers will have to think very differently. It will be less possible to win contracts as we've become used to in the last few years, and it will be about, I think, building relationships. But I do think that means that there will be opportunities. I am also chair of the advisory board for Kooth, a digital mental health company. Now, they have contracts with most CCGs around the country to provide digital support, particularly for children and young people. Well, that's a sort of collaboration, and actually they're quite well embedded into the NHS system now, and it works very well, and no one complains that this is the awful, evil private sector. And I do think actually that you can take some of the political heat out of the role of other providers by taking away this sort of competition threat.
Right.
And I think through, if the private sector or the third sector has a valuable contribution to make, and perhaps providing innovative care in some way that improves care and reduces cost, well, there are real opportunities for collaboration. My worry is that I think in some areas there is a risk of sort of cozy, complacent NHS monopolies sort of taking over. If we're honest, the positive thing about competition was that it kept people on their toes. It's a challenge, and I've talked to people in the Maudsley's Drug and Alcohol Service, for example, and they told me, we've sharpened our act. We had to win contracts, so we had to convince them that our outcomes were good, that we had an efficient service. Now, the danger is you lose that challenge and people become complacent. And that's rarely admitted by people on the left or the centre left. But we have to ensure that there are other ways of ensuring that the system is accountable and that there is an opportunity for other providers. Because at the end of the day, I'm completely agnostic about who provides a service. For me, it's about the quality of service and whether you get value for money from it.
I guess the obvious thoughts are, in terms of if you don't have competition driving the sort of the way you're describing, perhaps the need for greater accountability, transparency, and maybe external scrutiny
Yeah.
to be stronger in a system built on collaboration rather than competition. And I suppose the other thought is does collaboration give all the power to the big players at the expense of the smaller, innovative, more maybe community-based services? And I suppose the question is whether or not the guidance and the way that system is sort of managed, what collaboration looks like, could be steered in a way that does encourage all the people to take part in collaborations and collaborative endeavours, rather than it being, as it were, just the big players muscling and taking over everybody, swallowing everybody else up. And I suppose that's all to play for as the white paper and the bill goes through Parliament this year.
Yeah, because Phil, alongside the ICS, the integrated care system, which we've been talking about, which is the sort of the main organising level in the proposed new NHS, the other big development has been the, in a sense, requirement from NHS England that all NHS providers become part of what they call provider collaboratives.
Yes.
So that's neighbouring trusts collaborating with each other to achieve more uniform standards of care, but also to take over commissioning responsibilities. So, so give you an example, in South London, our trust, together with the neighbouring trusts, Oxley's and South West London and St George's, are part of the South London partnership, which is it's SLP. It's a provider collaborative. It was actually one of the earliest, set up about 4 years ago. Now all trusts will have to be part of something of that sort.
Right.
But we have taken over national commissioned services, including adult eating disorders, children and young people's tier 4 services from NHS England. And we now act as the commissioner.
Right.
Well, so you've got a provider acting as a commissioner. So there is the potential for quite tricky conflicts of interest here.
Yes.
And as I say, the danger is that they hog all the activity for themselves. The opportunity actually is that, and we're finding this in our case of South London, that actually the CCGs have done a pretty awful job. There's a group of people, complex care cases, where often people with the diagnosis of personality disorder, for example, long-term care, they are what the Care Quality Commission called funded and forgotten. So they get a placement out of area, they get funded for that, and then everyone just forgets about them. The problem is sorted, but their quality of life may be awful. So we're trying to use the opportunity now that we have some control over this to repatriate people back home, to improve collaborations with housing providers, with social care providers, community-based providers, to provide care close to home. Now, the opportunity is an enhanced quality of life for those people, being more ambitious for them, and potentially reduce cost. But we're, I think, taking a reasonably enlightened view and actually providing opportunities for new collaborations locally. But that may not happen everywhere. The experience, I think, will vary a lot across the country.
And yes, because it's the strength of those historic relationships and the people involved that often determine exactly how these things work out in practice.
And so often it's down to individuals. I mean, it's not very democratic, this. It's not very accountable. No. But an individual chief executive who has a real hostility to the private sector can really drive a sort of culture. That's the worry. And I think the danger is it could become less accountable than it has been.
And
alongside that, there are also clearly opportunities.
Yes, and the opportunity for, I know there are 42 ICSs and they've got this dual structure, which I might say something about in a second, but that's an opportunity for people outside the system, whether it's campaigning for change or a service deliverer, to dock onto these new structures and the people in them and start to establish, if not build on existing established relationships and service reputation and so on, to see how they can add value to those collaboratives.
Yeah, and incidentally, Phil, the provider collaboratives don't have to be entirely NHS. They can be third sector. I think also private sector. I think the East Midlands has a provider collaborative in mental health and learning disability that encompasses other providers. The rules aren't clear about who gets involved then in commissioning. It would have to be primarily the lead NHS provider. But so I think there needs to be a sort of strengthening of governance rules around that. But there are again opportunities to build collaborative arrangements.
Right. And just before we move on to the mental health, on this dual structure ICS levels, where you've got an ICS NHS board, which I kind of see as an operational, this gets all the NHS players together and money and so on, and then a health and care partnership board. Now, at the moment, that feels to me as though that's a fairly weak part of the system. It sort of sets the plans to which others should have regard, but it doesn't set the strategy. And I wonder whether there's more work to be done on, if we are to have a more strategic, integrated, tackling the drivers of ill health as well as providing services. That second structure inside the ICS that's been proposed needs a bit more beefing up. I don't know, and particularly with regards to mental health, I would have thought.
So there is guidance in the white paper to suggest that powers could be devolved from the main decision-making body to that partnership board. So there are opportunities there, but it's not mandated. And I suppose my worry is that in many areas it could just become a talking shop. And I think, I think too often the health and wellbeing boards are glorified talking shops with no real decision-making powers to lead to any positive changes. I think what we've got to try and do is to encourage the final legislation to push as far as possible towards localities exercising those powers to have to create a greater collaboration between health and social care. You and I'm quite sure, would favour a much more equal partnership between NHS and social care and a more devolved system than this white paper proposes. I think overall the white paper is a move in the right direction, but I think it could go further. It could embrace the NHS social care partnership as a partnership of equals. That would have been my preference, with some local accountability built into the structures. But again, it's important to say that another aspect of this is an encouragement to devolve powers and revenues to what they call place, which in the London context would be the borough, the local authority boundaries of a borough. It will be different in the Shire counties, but basing a place on a local authority boundary will be a common, I think, feature. And there's a clear encouragement to think about how you could devolve power and responsibility and revenue to those more local partnerships.
Yeah, and it's interesting on the push-pull point, really, which is government can push people to go in a direction, but people want to go there too. And it feels to me as this is permissive, then those local areas can grab it. I mean, if they want to work in that way, if they want to work in a genuine partnership involving all the providers and looking at the community strengths and so on, then they've got the opportunity to do so. I mean, I share your worry that in some areas it will revert to type and become led by the big beasts, the black holes of the acutes that suck in all the patients and the money, and rather than being a good partnership. Okay, let me move on. Norman, we've got a reform of the Mental Health Act white paper coming out, which is I think still calling for contributions. I think the 21st of April is the deadline.
Yeah.
What's your take on that white paper? What's your view of where it's going and how far it's going?
Well, again, a move in the right direction, but not far enough.
Okay.
It would be my summary. So this country takes a pretty risk-averse approach to mental health, and the default position is, if this person's conceivably a danger, lock them up. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's to bit the way the Mental Health Act works, and the powers are very considerable over someone's rights of liberty, and there are troublesome aspects to it. Not simply that we lock people up when in some cases they don't need to be locked up, but also there is a race dimension to this, because we lock up far more young black men than young white men. It rather reflects, I'm afraid, the criminal justice system. And then once they are locked up, they're far more likely to experience restraint, the use of restraint and other restrictive practices. So there are uncomfortable issues here that need to be addressed, and the Mental Health Act review looked specifically at the race dimension of this. But the positive news is that the whole direction of travel is towards enhancing people's rights. There are four guiding principles, new guiding principles: choice and autonomy, least restriction, therapeutic benefit, and the person as an individual. So, at its best, this is a move in the right direction, and it should result in fewer people being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Now, if you can combine a more enlightened legal framework with more investment in community, then the sort of, the golden spot, as it were, would be to improve the support for people to prevent people ever reaching crisis. And if you can do that, then you improve people's lives and you end up locking fewer people up. I visited Trieste in northern Italy last February, just before the lockdown took over in northern Italy. And Trieste has a fascinating approach to mental health. They lock far fewer people up than we do in this country. The Italian legal framework is more enlightened than ours. It doesn't lead to chaos on the streets and people being murdered and so forth. It is more enlightened. It encourages clinicians to sharpen their skills in negotiation and in relationship building. And the result is that they don't use restraint nearly as much as we do, and they support people more effectively in the community. So it's quite interesting to see that a different approach can work. And so my preference, as I've said, is for it to go further, but it's clearly a move in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Norman. And just one other topic I wanted to touch on was workforce in mental health and indeed learning disabilities. There's been a little bit of evidence that maybe vacancies are falling, but I mean, what's your take, what's your experience around the workforce challenges going forward for mental health?
Well, so there has been a marginal improvement. So during the pandemic, I think what we're witnessing is, tragically, too many people losing their employment or worried about losing their employment. And so the sort of the security of roles within the NHS becomes more attractive to people. I think it also becomes more attractive to stay in the job you've got rather than to take a leap into the unknown in a very uncertain world. So we're experiencing better attention and fewer vacancies.
Right.
But it's sort of like a 2-3% improvement. It's nothing dramatic.
Right.
And with the rule changes on immigration without freedom of movement, there could well be real constraints on the ability to recruit, particularly lower level staff who don't score enough points on the immigration point system. So, workforce is still a massive issue. It's a massive issue in mental health and in learning disability. Right. And I know in the non-NHS sector, it's often, in many parts of the country, it's very difficult to recruit good quality people. So, the need to continue to invest in training enough people to meet the health needs and care needs of the next few years becomes paramount.
And do you think that the primary care network initiatives, that kind of new way of thinking about the collaboration between NHS, GPs, other community health providers, the new link workers for social prescribing, obviously care workers, and we know the social care system's on its knees at the moment, but do they provide an opportunity for mental health as well to sort of identify and work with people who have got multiple needs, not just health needs and maybe disability needs and other health needs? Is that an opportunity for mental health there, or am I being too optimistic?
No, I think it's all a shift in the right direction, Phil.
Right.
I mean, on my first day in my job as minister, I went into Jeremy Hunt's office and I said, integration, that is what you need. He'd never heard of the word in the health context before. He was totally new to the NHS. But, approach that I think had been taken under the Lansley reforms.
Yeah.
But I think, bit by bit, policy has moved in a wise and sensible direction. And I think moving makes obvious sense. I'm a big fan of social prescribing. You've got to put proper resources behind it. Yeah. But, if there's someone with a mental health need in primary care, the default position is shove them on antidepressants. The numbers on antidepressants has grown massively. No evidence of any impact on their quality of life. No. Whereas social prescribing, getting someone involved in a gardening project or walking or art or whatever it might be, can have a massive positive impact on people's lives.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm heavily involved in something called Music for Dementia, which is a big campaign to encourage music to be a part of person's care if they've got dementia, because the impact of engaging people in singing or playing a musical instrument or joining a singing group or something like that, I think we've all seen the stories on the press and so on. It's been absolutely fabulous, and I'm a big fan of exactly that. And I think musical social prescriptions for people with dementia, for example, is this kind of innovation and new ways of thinking, and I think does hold the answer to getting out of an entirely clinically driven way of thinking about what health is, in fact. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, and just there are some funding announcements that have been made recently, Norman. I'm aware of the support for young people in schools. There's been some announcements around various posts linking into primary care networks and the funding for that. Are there any particular things this year, I mentioned those two, that we should be kind of mindful of?
Well, the 79 million announced last week to, this was primarily focused on these school support teams, which again, I think is a good move. It's a move in the right direction. Of course, the nuance is that this wasn't new money. This was 75 million out of the 500 million announced last year. Right. You tend to get this with government.
Yes. No, surely not.
and I should just say also, on a more general point, that I think as we move beyond the pandemic, the funding scenario is likely to be pretty tough. Public finances are in a dire state. We know that. And the government will at some point move towards trying to get back some control over that. So I think controls over public spending are to be expected. And I don't think health and care are going to be immune from that. So, I don't think we should imagine that what has happened over the last year, which has been quite a sort of shower of money for sort of keeping the system going, is going to persist. I don't see that happening.
No, I mean, and do you see? I mean, you and I have lived and died, as it were, the social care debate, which directly affects mental health services and people with mental health issues, and we still haven't got a solution, whatever that means, for funding, for properly funding a social care system, whatever that is. And yet, in the white paper on NHS reform, it talked about a decision, as it were, later this year. I think it meant 2021, although there's been a bit of argument about whether that means that. Is that still a job that needs doing? We've only got a glass half full, really.
Yeah, well, every government has kept pushing social care into the long grass. I'm sure you've got plenty of experiences to talk about from your time.
That's not really old pain.
Yeah. Rishi Sunak said last week that he hoped there would be a cross-party solution on reform and funding of social care. Whether they mean it, time will tell. They should have been doing reform of social care at the same time as they did reform of the NHS. In an ideal world, you never get an ideal world in politics, but I desperately hope that we need a new settlement for social care. We need new funding stream. We're not spending enough as a society on social care, and the consequences are there for all to see. A very fragile system, and in some parts of the country, providers focusing on the private market because the public's part of the market, people funded through local authorities, it's too hard to make a return. So, we need a new settlement desperately. And I favour probably the Japanese or German system of a sort of social insurance type of contribution from your 40s onwards, so that you protect younger working adults from an extra burden. But contributions from your estate, which was the favoured approach from Labour in the latter part of the 2000s, would be another alternative, acceptable alternative. Whatever, there's no perfect solution, but we need a settlement which introduces a new funding stream. Yes. We probably ought to get it. Are we going to have? Are there any questions?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I was going to ask Joe. Sorry, Joe. We've covered a wide territory here. Are there things that obviously people watching wanted to particularly have addressed?
Yes, absolutely. And quite nicely, a lot of the points that you've made, we've had quite a few through. So just going to present a few now. The Association of Mental Health Care Providers have pointed to some statistics from yesterday from Merseycare outlining that there's expected to be a 30% increase in demand for services over the next couple of years. The first part of the question being, where is the additional funding going to come from to support that? And then looping back to the start of the conversation around, are ICSs potentially a good thing, or are they potentially a threat to the NHS investment standard in mental health care? And just perhaps if you could talk a little bit more about, given how much local authorities do fund voluntary and community support for mental health services, are they forgotten as part of maybe the new reforms that are being suggested and ICSs as one to kick off with, please?
Okay, so the Merseycare point, well, this is the sort of psychological fallout from the pandemic that I referred to earlier. And I think there is a genuine concern. Every previous pandemic and every previous recession we've experienced a psychological impact of that. What we don't know is the scale of it. I think it's very likely that the impact will be greatest amongst children and young people. That's my real concern. Anxieties about the future will be strongest amongst young people. At Kooth, the digital mental health company I mentioned earlier, we've seen that they have an extraordinary amount of real-time data on what young people are raising with them day by day. And they've seen a significant increase in suicidal ideation, in self-harm concerns, and in eating issues, eating difficulties and sleep problems. Now, much of that will dissipate when the pandemic is over and people are back to school and normality returns. You know, people are fundamentally resilient, but there will be a proportion who, for whom there is lasting damage. And my worry is that the funding is unlikely to keep pace with the increase in demand that we're likely to see. This is all speculation because we can't be precise about what the impact will be. I think it's most likely to be most significant at primary care level, but there will be some impact on waiting times in particular for secondary mental health care. On the ICS, well, I made the point earlier that I think we've got to fight to ensure that mental health has a guaranteed place at the table where the decisions are taken about funding allocations, for goodness sake. You know, it's really important that we have a guaranteed place there. It can't be just a local option as is currently proposed in the white paper. I have concerns also about capital funding. There's an enormous need in mental health and learning disability for investment in modern facilities. Some of our facilities at the Maudsley are frankly unconscionable. You should not be putting people into inpatient facilities that we do at the moment. There needs to be investment in modern facilities. And yet the capital funding limits from the Treasury, it's called CDEL, C-D-E-L, impose real constraints. And the risk at an ICS level is that mental health capital needs will be quite marginal compared to the massive acute hospitals, and that they will then lose out, and it will be very difficult to get funding agreement for any capital projects. Now that opens potentially an opportunity for collaboration between public and private, in my view. It's not really been talked about yet, but could there be projects where private sector makes the investment and on a basis that the facility is then leased by, it's an alternative to the PFI scheme, but I think there's a potential for the exploration of partnership opportunities there.
I think one thing to watch out for on that, Norman, is the sticky hands of the Treasury all over the white paper, because I think they're bringing in some more controls for the department over external investment in NHS delivered services, because it breaks the designated expenditure limit, the DEL, as you said. It drives a bit of a coach and horses through the public sector borrowing requirement, because all this external money, even if it's not public money, still counts against the government's PSBR. And at the moment, I think Rishi Sunak is worried that lots of big trusts are going off and doing deals and building things, and they've got no control over it. So I think we should watch out for what's in the white paper, which is bringing back essentially control by the minister over capital expenditure decisions at a local level if they're going to breach potential cash limits set by
which
Treasury.
would be a very retrograde step.
Well, I know. I think the white paper needs looking at, and that needs looking at, because I think it's a specific concern that the Treasury have got. And you can see where almost the paragraphs have been inserted by the Treasury in the white paper. And just on the local funding point, I wonder whether the comprehensive spending review in November is another opportunity. I think Simon Stevens has been dropping hints everywhere that, you know, the NHS needs more money to deal with the pandemic consequences for the NHS, and is sort of signalling that there may be some announcement. Now, in terms of the mental health and learning disability spheres, I wonder whether there's work to be done to try to influence that CSR, and now, you know, the comprehensive spending review for the next 3 years, to get not just more money for acutes, if you can see what I mean, but for the system as a whole, to achieve these system-wide objectives of a shift to community-based parity of esteem for mental health and indeed social care, you know, as all part of that solution to the post-pandemic.
Well, I think there's a massive lobbying job to be done, actually, and you know, I think that a feature of the last decade is that mental health has found its voice to a degree, and has, you know, gone out and made the case and made it harder for government to ignore it. And, you know, to be fair, the young royals, is a topical subject this week. The young royals have, you know, have helped because their articulation of mental health issues again makes it more acceptable, and you know, makes it easier for a teenager to come out and talk about their own issues. So I'm a very big fan of the way in which society's opened up on mental health. But we've got to, in this critical period, in the run up to the spending review, we've got to make that case, because we can't assume that we've won that battle. It could very easily slip back in the post-pandemic world with such pressure on acute hospitals.
Absolutely. And just on the capital investment point, last spending review, there was 600 million announced to move away from outdated dorms. Clearly, that's not enough. It's just part of the solution. But yeah, absolutely. I think that's an area where different organisations can lobby on. I'm just going to package up a couple of other questions, if that's okay. One from One Medical Group and one from Together All. Firstly, this links into what we were saying earlier about primary care networks, but what examples have we seen, and what more can be done to move mental health care support upstream into the primary care process, and partnerships between community and voluntary groups? Norman, you may have some examples from your trust. And then the second one is related to some of those third-party providers. How important is it that they are accredited and can demonstrate the quality via CQC inspections? And that may not just be physical bricks and mortar support, but also in the digital space, the kind of services that they're offering.
Well, so I think there's a massive opportunity now for other organisations to play a part in improving community support for people with mental ill health. So I'll give you the example of the Maudsley. I've come in, I've made clear that we need to shift the emphasis from hospital inpatient care to community support. Proportionately, we spend a bigger proportion of our budget on hospital treatment and therefore a lower percentage on community support. And this is the direction of travel within the NHS. You know, the best trusts, whether it's Hertfordshire Partnership, East London, I think Berkshire would be another example. The trusts that have achieved outstanding status, they're the ones who are thinking ahead, planning for modern progressive mental health care, supporting people more effectively in the community. And if you move in that direction, you simply don't do it on your own. You do it in collaboration with housing providers, yes, with employment agencies. You know, I was in touch with someone yesterday about the idea of establishing a social enterprise to provide employment opportunities for people who've been users of the Maudsley services. There's a whole range of ancillary services where we contract out with agencies that are often remote from the Maudsley. Could we do it more effectively through local third sector organisations collaborating with us, getting money back into the community, acting, as they say in the jargon, as an anchor institution?
Yes.
You know, this is the way in which we're going to have to be thinking more and more. And actually, employment should be a prime goal of mental health trusts. It hasn't been in the past, but that's how we need to start thinking now. Because in terms of someone's quality of life, giving someone the dignity of a job, the sort of sense of self-worth, is worth 1,000, you know, weekly visits by a mental health clinician. It's or more likely a monthly visit. You know, it's real life changes that we should be focusing on as the goals for people who've used our services, and that requires rich collaborations with social care, with housing, with employment, and so on.
I think that I agree with Norman about that. The idea, you know, instead of community castles, which is what hospitals are at the moment, we want community anchors that sort of spread out and engage, and instead of pouring people through and hauling up the gate, they're kind of sending their people out into the community to work in a much more collaborative way in the community. I think that's a really important direction. I guess the challenge to some of that is some of that funding is through the NHS, through primary care networks, and they have got more money, and it does require GPs, I think, to have a community-oriented way of thinking about their patients and where they work. Many of them do. We know some excellent examples in Bow in London, for example, of GP practices that operate, and they have the housing in their surgeries and in their reception areas. It's a totally joined up way of working. I mean, that best practice exists, and it does. We just need to get it sort of out.
But I'll give you an example. I mean, Bromley by Bow, I've visited it, and it's magnificent.
Fantastic.
But I'll give you an example. The Chief Operating Officer, who we've just recruited, at his interview, he talked about the Somerset Alliance, where the Mental Health Trust has collaborated with the local authority, with Rethink Mental Illness, and with other third sector organisations to create this more community-based approach. He talked about how he advocated giving some of our money to other organisations who are better able to spend it than us. Now, for me, that was a positive reason to employ him, not to reject him. So that's the direction we need to go in, and mental health trusts need to be willing to, release some of their resources to others who could do things better in collaboration.
On the CQC point, Joe, it's interesting. I think it is the case that any third-party provider needs to show its quality, and CQC inspections, provider inspections, are obviously one way of doing that, not the only way, but they are important, and people need to understand and value those. I always think of a CQC visit and inspection not as a threat but an opportunity. If you're a good chief executive, this is a moment when you can, shift on the kind of increasing quality that you've been wanting to achieve through using that. And I think digital, in particular, ways of working, not just the back office, but front line. And there's been some very, very good pandemic examples of people working differently through digital means, not, actual practical, physical, digital tools for monitoring your health and performance, but also delivering better care and
absolutely,
records and so on. But also, I think the CQC is moving into this system performance territory. How well is the system as a whole? The purpose of the integrated care systems is not to have silos of hospitals and GPs and community deliverers. It's to have a system-wide approach where we consistently use the system to keep people out of hospitals that don't need to be there, and in fact get better value for money and better treatment closer to home. And I think the CQC will be involved in trying to capture and measure that. And I think providers need to be very mindful that they need to be seen to be cooperators in a system approach.
I agree.
Their own performance as a deliverer.
And now it should be a move in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. Just very wary of time because only a couple of minutes left, but just a couple of final questions. Are local authorities continuing to be squeezed given the budgetary pressures we've spoken about, but their statutory obligations to deliver certain services to those that need mental health care support? Is there a prioritisation of care? Crisis going to be emerging. And then secondly, just looking ahead, we touched on children and young people, but what we expect the Children's Commission, the review of children's care will be in the coming months and years to report next year on that.
The local authorities are still under enormous pressure, and there's a real worrying potential trend. So Lewisham in our area has announced a cut to funding of children's mental health services at the local authority level. These are the low-level support services. And they're doing it in the knowledge that more money is coming through the NHS. So they're saying overall funding isn't being cut for children's services. But if we end up getting more money into the NHS, but it's taken out at the local authority preventive end, we achieve nothing. And there's a real worry that local authorities around the country, under pressure on their funding, will see opportunities to take a little bit out of children's mental health, which would be a disastrous thing to happen. Remind me what the other point was, Joe?
Children.
So I think I should just alert people to that there's a the Health and Social Care Select Committee is doing an inquiry at the moment into children and young people's mental health. And they're looking at how the government's commitments are playing out. The rollout, incidentally, of these school support teams is taking absolute years. Now, there's some speeding up of that with the 79 million announced last week, but it's still perilously slow and will take far too long, in my view. I think the direction of travel will continue, particularly with children and young people, to be focused more on working in schools. I also think we should be looking at international best practice. I'm very attracted by the Headspace model from Australia, where they provide sort of primary care-based open access for young people. Whatever your angst might be, it might be something going on in your head, you might be worried about drugs and alcohol issues or your sexuality, you can go to your local Headspace centre. And I think that type of low-level, early, easy access is a very attractive proposition that the UK should be exploring further.
A couple of points from me on the local authority stuff, Joe, is first of all, I mean, the squeeze, absolutely right, Norman, the squeeze is not getting any better, it's worse. And we're seeing some organisations handing back contracts because the fees that they're being paid by the local authority to deliver the services, domiciliary care, for example, are just not financially viable, even for the not-for-profit sector, as it were.
Yeah.
The numbers are bad. And of course, because the pay of the workforce and the turnover as a result of the high 30-40% turnover of care staff means that maintaining quality when you've got that kind of level of churn of people is very difficult, let alone the impact of Brexit and other things on workforce availability. Second thing is, in the white paper, people would have seen the Secretary of State is taking control of intervening on local authorities who are regarded to have failed in their social care duties, having been inspected by the CQC, which they haven't been before. So that's a new measure and a new power for the Secretary of State to intervene if a local authority is failing to deliver their duties. However, if the reason for them failing to deliver it is lack of money, I don't know where that takes the Secretary of State, because if you haven't got the money to deliver it, you can't deliver it. But that's worth noting. I think there is going to be increasingly a switch to unitaries. In other words, in two areas, creating unitary councils, not driven by a rational sort of approach to what's the best way to organise local government, but more about this council's now falling off the financial edge, and the only way to save that is to create a unitary. That's happened in Northamptonshire, for example, where they created two unitaries because the county council fell over, largely because of the social care budget, among other things. And lastly, the council tax premium, the social care 3% premium, which councils are going to actually take up fully the opportunity of raising the full 3%. And the problem, as we know with council tax, it raises large amounts of money in areas that don't need it because they've got a high value base of their property because they're in the south, west, southeast, and areas that need the money the most, where 3% on council tax premium doesn't raise enough. So it's a very poor system by, I think it was George Osborne, shifted that taxation raising from government to local government in a way that is unhelpful because it raises the wrong amounts of money in the wrong areas. But that is something to look out for, is that there may be some money coming from those decisions made by individual councils during this current, councils are right now sitting down, setting their budget and council tax increases.
Thanks. And yeah, that's got quite a lot of media attention, and just saw with a small pay increase, but they're going to be hit with an increase in their council tax, and that's getting into the airwaves more and more. We've run slightly over, but I think it is warranted it. Huge amounts to discuss. Thank you very much, Phil and Norman. Some really, really useful insights. I hope everyone in attendance found that really useful. Covered a lot of ground, lots going on in this area at the moment. We will be sharing a summary of the key takeaways and key points for you to consider, and happy to answer any follow-up questions that you might have. But yeah, thank you all again for attending this morning, and thank you again to Phil and Sir Norman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hope it was helpful. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.